Now that we've seen how Moses handled his record of early violence and hope, we should turn briefly to Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8, later violence and the hope of deliverance. Let's look especially at chapter 6 verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. We have already noted that the Nephilim were mighty warriors, well known for their exploits. But notice that Moses made an important comment about the Nephilim. He said that the Nephilim existed on earth in the primeval days and also afterward. By adding this allusion to Nephilim warriors living after the flood, Moses reminded his Israelite readers that they had encountered Nephilim in their recent history. The only other place where the term Nephilim appears in the Bible is in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. There, the spies Moses sent into Canaan reported seeing Nephilim. They said these words, "The land we explored devours those living in it. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The unfaithful spies reported that the land of Canaan was a terribly violent and threatening place, and that among the inhabitants of Canaan were Nephilim, vicious warriors who struck fear into their hearts. Now, unfortunately, this report led the first generation following Moses to turn away from God's call to conquest. And God was so disturbed by this lack of faith that he sent the Israelites into the wilderness to wander aimlessly until the first generation had died off and a new generation was prepared to take up the cause of conquest. In this light, we can understand how Moses drew another strong connection between this portion of his primeval history and the experience of Israel. He wanted his Israelite readers to associate the primeval Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6 with the terrifying Nephilim warriors of Canaan. In this way, the violence and hope of deliverance in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 spoke directly to the threat of violence in the conquest of Canaan. So far in our examination of the original meaning of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8, we have seen the primeval characters associated with people in Israel's contemporary experience. Now we should ask a second question. What were the implications of these associations for the people of Israel as they followed Moses toward the Promised Land? To understand the heart of Moses' message to Israel, we need to remember the basic scenario that appears twice in this material. You will recall that Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8 contains two scenarios of violence and hope of deliverance. Chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 5 verse 32 focused on the violence of Cain and his descendants. Yet, chapter 5 verses 29 and 32 mention Noah in order to indicate that deliverance would come through him. In much the same way, just as Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 report the violence of the sons of God and the Nephilim, Genesis chapter 6 verse 8 mentions Noah once again to indicate that God intended to deliver from these threats as well. For the Israelites following Moses, these scenarios should have been good news. They revealed what God had already done for them and what he was about to do for them. On the one hand, just as God had used Noah to deliver Israel's ancestors from the Canaanites, he had already used Moses to deliver the Israelites from the Egyptians. On the other hand, just as God had used Noah to bring deliverance from the primeval Nephilim, he was about to use Moses to deliver the Israelites as they faced the threat of Nephilim in the land of Canaan.